Hello everyone, I haven't made a video in a while, so I'll just quickly talk about some movies I saw in theaters and one I saw on Netflix, because I have some stuff to say about them. The first movie I saw in theaters this month was The Old Man and the Gun, which is the new movie by David Lowery, who directed A Ghost Story, one of my favorites from last year. This movie isn't quite as good as A Ghost Story, but it's still really good. It's shot on a really beautiful 16mm film, which is one of the things that makes every scene really a joy to watch. The look of the film fits so incredibly well with the time period and nostalgic vibe of the story, and the attention to detail in every aspect of the filmmaking craft is something I really appreciate. In complete contrast to A Ghost Story, this movie is incredibly energetic and often exhilarating at times, yet it still keeps the same poetic nature found in that movie. This movie comments on age, what it means to be satisfied with life, the meaning of love in many different ways. The entire movie is essentially a big celebration of life, and it ultimately tries to tell its audience member to try to live a life that is worth living. There's a lot more I can say regarding the philosophy of this film, but I feel like a lot of it just speaks for itself. It's sweet, it's charming, it's poetic, it has characters you can very easily relate to and care about. Most of the performances in this film are great, with Casey Affleck actually being the standout here, although this is a great film for Robert Redford to end on. That is, if this film is actually his last project. Sure, this movie has one kind of cringy line. A lot of the events in the story do feel familiar, and its themes have clearly been explored before in arguably better ways. But this is still a great, simple, feel good movie to watch on a rainy day. It might not be a groundbreaking masterpiece, but it doesn't try to be one either. Honestly, this is probably one of the most fun movies I've seen this year, and I definitely recommend this one to pretty much everyone. The next movie I want to talk about is The Ballad of Buster Scruggs, the new movie by the Coen brothers on Netflix. I had mixed feelings about this one after I finished it, but I enjoyed it enough to consider it to be a really good movie. My issue with this film at first was that the second and third stories, because this is an anthology film with 6 stories, felt a bit too short and underdeveloped, especially after a pretty complete and great first story. I loved the fourth and fifth story though, which I found to be the perfect length. The last story might have felt a bit too short as well, but it was still a very engaging watch. The more I've let this film sit with me though, the more I start to love the stories that I didn't love at first. Certain beautiful shots and lines of dialogue are still on my mind and come to haunt me every now and then. This movie is about death, and the various ways in which death follows people around in the Midwest. Death by arrogance, death by bad luck, death as the result of greed. These stories all play out like fables, which makes sense because they're literally presented in a storybook in the film itself. The last story in this film works as a discussion about life and death and in a way forces the audience to think about what they just saw, making that the perfect conclusion. Despite being an anthology film presented as a short story collection, the order in which these stories are told is still very important. The movie has an almost 6-act-like structure, each act being in its own separate story. The stories in the first half are all more abrupt in their endings and more direct in how death is presented. The stories in the second half, however, take their time, which really makes sense because it's as if the characters are trying harder to avoid death. Despite these stories all having similar themes and subjects, I can't say any of them really felt all that predictable. I'm really looking forward to watching this a second time, because now knowing what I'm getting into, I think I'd get more out of it. It's definitely a grower, but the screenplay, performances, cinematography, and soundtrack are all absolutely fantastic. Rewatching certain scenes right now already make me like this movie more, so yep, go check this one out. It's funny, it's clever, and it's tragic. The last movie I want to talk about in this video is one I saw in theaters, Suspiria by Luca Guadagnino. He's the same director as Call Me By Your Name, which was my favorite film from last year. This one isn't quite as good as that one, but this is a very different film, so there's not much to compare. This film is a remake, however, sort of, so I will compare this one to the original Suspiria from 1977, directed by Dario Argento. Everyone who's seen the original Suspiria knows that it's a movie that's well known because of its usage of bright colors, which influenced movies like The Neon Demon, for example. It's not exactly a great story, but it works really well as an art piece rather than a great narrative. Still, the movie has its fair share of nauseating moments, and it's pretty spooky and fun, so I enjoyed the original. Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria, however, despite it arguably being a less tight narrative, works much better and makes for a much more satisfying and thought-provoking experience. Whereas the original Suspiria was simple and to the point and only 90 minutes long, this one is a 2.5 hour long period piece. We're also told right from the start that this one is told in 6 acts and an epilogue set in divided Berlin, which already makes this one very different from the original, setting wise. Having this story be told in the real world instead of a dreamlike version of it makes it work much better. This isn't to say that dreamlike versions of our world are bad in movies. There are movies I adore with those kinds of worlds. But it makes it more unique to think that this is something that's actually happened, even though you know it didn't. To try and really explain this movie is hard, because I don't know how to actually cohesively review it. It tells the same story as the original, except it doesn't. It's definitely a horror movie, but scaring you isn't its main goal. It's such an incredibly dense and layered experience, and I still don't think I really understand it. I understand bits and pieces of it, but not the whole. What I do know is that this film is one of the most unique things I've seen all year, and I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. Its pacing somehow manages to be both slow and fast at the same time, and I don't really know how to explain that. Certain scenes are essentially built up to be slow, but they go by in such a fast way. You honestly need to watch the movie for yourself to really understand what I'm saying, but it's essentially kind of like literally experiencing a dream while being awake. Maybe I'm just bullshitting, maybe the movie is just bullshitting, but I don't feel like that, because a lot of it just feels too purposeful to me. It's an emotional, horrifying, and surreal experience that just breaks the rules of filmmaking constantly. This movie is meticulously crafted chaos, and I don't understand it yet, but I don't feel like I need to right now. I was engaged and hypnotized by it, I was lost in my thoughts and often blown away at the stuff that was shown on screen. It's not perfect, but certain scenes really are perfect, mainly the dance scenes. This film is very melancholic and beautiful, but also disturbing. Somehow, a beautiful, sad soundtrack by Tom York fits perfectly with such horrifying events. It's like feeling guilt for such unspeakable things. I'm still thinking about this film, and the more I think about it, the more I like it, despite it being very flawed. It's a movie that works despite of its flaws, but also because of its flaws, and that's something really special. There are distracting things about this one, such as the CGI blood at the end not really working, but at the end of the day it only makes it feel more unique if you really think about it. I think this movie was great, so check it out if you're crazy like me.